I want you to hold two facts in your head at the same time. Fact 1. This week, the CEO of the largest bank in America, the man who spent years calling crypto a fraud, who fired employees for trading it, who built a career on the premise that Wall Street does not need to be replaced, went on record and admitted that blockchain systems will compete with traditional banks. Not might, not could, will, present tense, active, already in motion. Fact 2. XRP is trading at $1.32. Sit with that for a second. The most powerful institutional validation in this asset's entire history just happened out loud, on the record, from the one person whose opinion the financial establishment has deferred to for 2 decades, and the price barely moved. Now ask yourself the question that should be keeping you up tonight. Is that a problem? Or is that the last time in history you will be able to buy XRP before Jamie Dimon's words reach the people who act on them? Welcome back to XRP News Flow Signals, where we track what the signal says before the noise catches up to it. This is not financial advice. Always do your own research. But if you want to understand why the gap between Jamie Dimon's admission and XRP's current price is the most important number in this entire space right now, let's map it out precisely. Let's start with a hard truth that most people in this space are too excited to say carefully. Jamie Dimon's admission is not the beginning of this story. It is the closing of a gap that has existed for years between what institutions say in public and what they do in private. Here is the documented private behavior. While Dimon was publicly calling Bitcoin a fraud, JP Morgan was quietly filing blockchain patents. While he was dismissing digital assets as speculation, JP Morgan was building its own digital infrastructure and establishing positions that required the exact regulatory clarity it was publicly opposing. The public posture and the private behavior pointed in opposite directions. The public admission this week means the gap between those two directions has closed. When the gap closes, there is only one direction left. Now let's be precise about what Dimon actually said, because precision matters more than celebration when the source is this significant. He acknowledged that blockchain-based systems are emerging competitors to traditional banking. The word emerging is doing specific work here, not future, not theoretical. Emerging, present tense, already in motion, already exerting competitive pressure on infrastructure that has operated without serious competition for decades. This is not a concession speech. It is a strategic repositioning. And in institutional finance, strategic repositioning from the top of the hierarchy is the signal that everyone below that hierarchy acts on. Now, layer on what JP Morgan did 6 days before the Clarity Act was confirmed as a done deal among key stakeholders. On April 6th, 6 days into the month, JP Morgan published its April institutional report. Inside that report, buried where most retail coverage never reaches, a direct statement that broader blockchain adoption hinges on regulatory clarity, and that institutions are specifically waiting for the Clarity Act before deploying capital at scale. 6 days later, the Clarity Act was confirmed. Read that sequence again. JP Morgan names the exact gate that institutions are waiting at. Then, the gate opens 6 days later. JP Morgan manages $4 trillion in assets and employs some of the most sophisticated financial intelligence operations in the world. Their April report does not accidentally name a specific piece of legislation 6 days before it is confirmed. That is not coincidence. That is an institution with visibility into a timeline that retail does not have, publishing its read on that timeline in a document that, if you knew how to read it, told you exactly what was coming. Now let's run the math that makes the $1.32 price tag genuinely difficult to explain. JP Morgan's April report projects the tokenized real-world asset market will reach $13 trillion within the next 4 years. Not crypto-native capital, not speculative retail money. The existing stock of global financial assets, real estate, commodities, private credit securities being migrated from legacy infrastructure onto blockchain settlement rails. The assets already exist. They are already valued. The only question is which rails they move on. And here is the specific question that $13 trillion raises. JP Morgan is not a passive observer of this process. They are a builder. They are already filing patents, already building digital infrastructure, already positioning products around the tokenization wave they are projecting. When JP Morgan says 13 trillion, they are not describing someone else's market. They are describing the market they intend to operate inside. Which blockchains qualify for that operation? The answer has a short list of technical requirements: 4-second settlement finality, fractions of a cent per transaction, institutional compliance infrastructure, NYDFS compliant stablecoins, SWIFT certification, audited reserves, formal banking relationships with the institutions that need to use the rails, regulatory clarity that allows Tier 1 banks to transact without legal exposure. JP Morgan's report does not name XRP, but it describes a precise set of infrastructure characteristics. The XRP Ledger settles in 3 to 5 seconds. Transaction costs measure in fractions of a cent. Ripple NLUSD is NYDFS compliant with independently audited reserves. Ripple has formal relationships with over 300 financial institutions globally. The institutional DeFi roadmap includes credentialed domains and zero-knowledge privacy features that large financial institutions require. They described the infrastructure. They did not name it, but the description has one match at institutional scale. Now add the BlackRock dimension. BlackRock's global head of retirement solutions stated publicly that 80% of Americans will gain crypto exposure through their 401k plans. Not could, will. And the mechanism is specific: a regulatory framework that opens defined contribution plans, the standard private sector 401k, to the same alternative asset access that defined benefit pension funds already have. When retirement capital flows through this channel, it does not flow into individual tokens chosen by account holders. It flows into funds managed by BlackRock, JP Morgan, Fidelity, and Vanguard. The assets that end up in those funds are the ones with spot ETFs, institutional custody infrastructure, and the regulatory clarity that the Clarity Act will now codify. XRP has all three. The $1.32 price tag does not reflect the JP Morgan $13 trillion projection, the BlackRock 401k pipeline, or the Franklin Templeton classification of XRP Ledger as infrastructure. A word that inside a $1.7 trillion asset manager determines how capital gets allocated, how products get built, and how the asset gets presented to institutional clients. Infrastructure does not get priced like speculation. It just hasn't been repriced yet. Let's talk about Franklin Templeton specifically, because I think this is the single most underweighted development in this entire week's news cycle. Franklin Templeton manages $1.7 trillion in assets. Their executives did not describe the XRP Ledger as a speculative opportunity. They did not use words like potential or emerging or promising. They used one word: infrastructure. In institutional asset management, that word is not rhetorical. It is a classification, and classification determines everything: how an asset is evaluated, how it is modeled in a portfolio, how it is presented to institutional clients, and how capital gets allocated to it. Speculative assets get allocated a small percentage of a high-risk bucket. Infrastructure gets built around. Infrastructure becomes a dependency. Dependencies attract capital that does not leave. When Franklin Templeton calls the XRP Ledger infrastructure and simultaneously holds an XRP spot BTF and has tokenized a money market fund on XRP Ledger, they are not making a statement. They are showing you their balance sheet's relationship with this technology. Now connect this to the Clarity Act sequence. The Clarity Act being confirmed as a done deal among key stakeholders is not the same as signed into law. The honest analytical position requires holding both truths simultaneously. The direction is unambiguous. The timeline has uncertainty. Implementation and rulemaking follow passage, typically a 12 to 24-month runway before full institutional deployment at scale. But here is what the Clarity Act actually does at the moment of passage, before a single rulebook is written. It removes the legal ambiguity that compliance departments use to justify inaction. It gives investment committees a statutory basis for approval rather than an interpretive one. It converts "we are waiting for clarity," which JP Morgan said explicitly in their April report, into "we have clarity, begin deployment." Dimon's admission, combined with JP Morgan's $13 trillion projection, combined with BlackRock's 401k pipeline, combined with Franklin Templeton's infrastructure classification, combined with the Clarity Act confirmation. These are not 5 separate stories. They are one story, told by 5 different institutions in the same week. And XRP is still at $1.32. I want to pause here for a second, because what we just mapped is not a collection of weekly news items. It is a convergence of 5 simultaneous institutional signals pointing at the same infrastructure in the same week, while the price sits disconnected from all of them. Tracking that kind of signal gap between what institutions are documenting and what the market has priced in is exactly what XRP News Flow Signals is built for. If you want that signal in your feed consistently, subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the rulemaking timeline that follows the Clarity Act is going to produce specific, datable deployment triggers. And I do not want you finding out about them after the price has already reflected them. That is what this channel is here to prevent. Let's be specific about what comes next, because the timeline is not vague. Catalyst 1, Clarity Act, passage to rulemaking, confirmed as a done deal among key stakeholders. Formal passage converts institutional intent to institutional permission. The 12 to 24-month rulemaking runway that follows is not a delay. It is the construction phase of the deployment infrastructure. Every month of that runway is a month where capital is being pre-positioned before public deployment is visible. Catalyst 2, BlackRock 401k channel opening. The regulatory framework that opens defined contribution plans to crypto asset exposure is tied directly to the legislative environment the Clarity Act is creating. When that channel opens, the capital flowing through it is not discretionary. It is systematic, automatic, and managed by firms that have already classified XRP Ledger as infrastructure. The allocation follows the classification. Catalyst 3, Ripple OCC charter decision. Active application. Coinbase conditional approval on April 2nd proved the template. Ripple's application is more complete. Passage of stablecoin legislation through the Genius Act, running parallel to the Clarity Act, creates the federal lane that RLUSD's institutional scaling requires. Catalyst 4, Franklin Templeton and BlackRock product expansion. When 2 of the world's largest asset managers have already built XRP-adjacent products and classified the underlying ledger as infrastructure, the next product cycle, broader index inclusion, retirement fund products, institutional custody expansion, follows the regulatory clarity that is now confirmed as incoming. 4 catalysts, all on a visible, legislative-driven timeline, none of them speculative in origin. Here is the gap that defines this moment. Jamie Dimon said, "Will," not might, not could, will. JP Morgan published a report naming the exact gate 6 days before it opened. BlackRock said 80% of Americans will hold crypto in retirement accounts. Franklin Templeton called the XRP Ledger infrastructure, and XRP is at $1.32. The gap between what the largest institutions in the world are documenting and what the market has priced is not a contradiction. It is a lag. Lags have always existed between institutional positioning and retail pricing in every major asset repricing in financial history. The question is not whether the lag closes. The question is whether you are positioned before it does or after. Let me leave you with the complete frame. Jamie Dimon spent years building a career on the premise that Wall Street does not need to be replaced. This week, he told you it does, on record, in plain language, with no ambiguity in the tense he chose. JP Morgan published a report naming the exact legislative trigger institutions are waiting for. 6 days later, that trigger was confirmed. BlackRock is opening the largest retail capital channel in America to crypto exposure. Franklin Templeton classified the XRP Ledger not as an asset, but as infrastructure. And through all of it, XRP sits at $1.32. That price is not a reflection of these developments. It is a reflection of the lag between when institutions know something and when the market prices it. Jamie Dimon just told you it is over for the old system. The question is whether you heard him. If this breakdown gave you the signal clarity you were looking for, subscribe to XRP News Flow Signals before the rulemaking cycle begins. We will be tracking every deployment trigger, every institutional filing, and every legislative milestone in real time, before the price reflects them, not after. Drop one word below. Lag if you think the price catches up soon. Wait if you think it takes longer. Either way, let's track it together. Stay sharp. The signal does not lie. Not financial advice.